I know. There we go. So, without further ado, I want to welcome everybody tonight. I'm here with Ned White, who is a Unitarian minister, and together we're going to talk a little bit about Christmas, about Hanukkah, about the stories, because so much of this is about the stories that we tell to ourselves, to our children, to our communities and our society at large. And we're so glad to have you here to hear the stories to share as well. I want to thank Lori Yanowitz, who is really the driving force behind BHSS's lifelong learning, and thank her for putting all of this together. The plan is that Ned and I are going to do some presenting, and then we will open things up at the end for questions. If you have questions in the meantime, I'm going to invite you to put them in the chat box rather than unmuting so that we can make our way through the program. Ned, tell them a little bit about yourself before you begin, if you would.
Well, the most important thing, of course, is that Lori and Rich's son, Brandon, is married to my niece, Caitlin. So there's a familial connection, and I just had the pleasure of enjoying Thanksgiving at Lori's, which was, of course, fabulous and wonderful in every possible way. So I'm fully fortified for this, and they have graciously asked me to come back after a presentation we did about Easter and Passover, and I'm delighted to be back in your august company. So thank you very, very much. I'm a retired Unitarian Universalist minister, actually older than I look, but we won't go there, and very happy to be involved in tonight's conversation about these two really important and interesting holidays that often intersect in peculiar ways. So without further ado, I think what I'll do is offer my first little story, and then we'll turn it over to the rabbi for a look into Hanukkah, and then I'll do Christmas, and then we're off to the races. This is a story that came to my attention a number of years ago. It's called A Tale of Two Trees by Herb Klein. I knew I had a problem as soon as I hung up the phone after talking to my sister. I had just invited her and her family to spend the Christmas holiday with me, my wife Carolyn, and our 5 children. It meant that she, her husband, and their 2 sons would be our guests for at least 4 days. The time involved was no problem, neither was accommodating them. It was a matter of religious beliefs and customs that presented a dilemma for me. My younger sister Jean and I are Jewish. We have been raised by our parents with the religious background of that faith. Jean had married within our religion. She and her husband continued to practice Jewish customs in their family life. Their children were being taught accordingly. I had married a divorcee, a Catholic girl with 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Subsequently, we had twin girls of our own. We decided to avoid the problem of religious conflict by restricting its effects on our daily life. It called for sacrifice and understanding for my wife and myself to respect each other's religious background. It was particularly difficult to be considerate of our parents and their beliefs and wishes. That was the essence of the problem that confronted me. I knew my sister and her husband would not object to the Christmas decorations about our home, nor the traditional tree and its trimmings that they would find within our home. What concerned me was pleasing the children without confusing them. Also being considerate of the grandparents who were invited, how could I meet the customary requirements of a Christian Christmas and its counterpart, the Jewish Hanukkah, so both would be served and all would be pleased, children and grown-ups alike? Frankly, I was puzzled by the prospects of the task before me. In many respects, the 2 religious holidays are similar. They occur about the same time each year. Then there are the symbolic decorations, the Christian Star of Bethlehem, the Jewish Star of David, the lighting of the candles, the seasonal foods and songs, the exchange of gifts, a general atmosphere of merriment and celebration that is common to both. One point of notable difference that is particularly significant to the children involves the Christmas tree. Nothing similar had been part of the Jewish custom before. In modern times, however, due to mixed marriages and more homogenized religious committees, a new concept is evolved. It is facetiously referred to as the Hanukkah bush, which was trimmed appropriately with Jewish symbols and ornaments for that holiday. After simmering a while in the stew of my own making, I suddenly had an inspiration that I believed would be my salvation. Applying a humorous interpretation, it occurred to me that any evergreen which nature had endowed with cones, spelled capital C-O-H-E-N-S, must bear a resemblance to things Jewish. Therefore, I reasoned it could not be considered sacrilegious or disrespectful for a pine tree to serve as a Hanukkah bush. With this thought in mind, I proceeded to act on it without any further delay. On Christmas Eve, when my sister's family and 3 pairs of grandparents, 1 Catholic and 2 Jewish, arrived as planned, they were surprised to find 2 evergreen trees standing side by side, each trimmed in holiday splendor with symbols of the Christian and Jewish faiths, respectively. All the gifts for both families were heaped in common confusion on the floor in front of both. It was a gratifying, harmonious scene, one of the most heartwarming for me to have fulfilled the needs of the occasion. It served the purpose well. Any religious distinction between the 2 trees was completely forgotten during the bedlam that developed later in the evening. The 2 trees were under constant assault, being bumped and jostled as the 7 children swarmed around them. Gift wrappings were being ripped apart, their contents displayed and appraised with appropriate sound effects. The mixed holiday evening was a success, even gaining a somewhat restrained approval of the previous skeptical grandparents. Later, after the grandparents had left and everyone else had gone to bed and were presumably asleep, I thought I heard a noise downstairs and decided to investigate cautiously. I was rather surprised to find the tree with the Jewish trimmings had somehow tipped over slightly and was leaning against the Christmas tree. The branches and decorations of both trees were intermingled. They appeared to be one. I wondered about trying to rearrange the trees at that time, but thought it might prove to be more complicated than it seemed. Concerned about disturbing the others already sleeping, I decided to wait until morning for the repair job. I switched off the overhead lights as I left the living room, and with a parting glance over my shoulder, I was startled by what I saw. I will swear that on that serenely silent, holy night, there appeared to be a supernatural aura not caused by any decorative lighting that glowed above an apparently blessed merger of these 2 dual holiday trees. Thus ends the lesson.
Thank you. So one of the things that I was doing as you were telling the story is I was probing, where am I comfortable? Where am I uncomfortable? And I think a lot of us do that. And then when I find moments of discomfort, I ask, where is that coming from? What is that? And I don't know if you can hear Tevye singing tradition or something along those lines, or that's not what I was raised with, or will the kids understand, or will the grown-ups understand? And one of the things that's interesting to me is the way that we as individuals, as modern, some of us Jews, some of us not on the screen, construct meaning in our lives. And one of the things that I think is so important to keep in mind is that as much as we think that there are traditions that come back from in Hebrew we say Misinai, from Sinai, that the Jews in particular have been changing and adapting and evolving our stories and our customs and the way that we do things for a very long time. And so as I experience that potential moment of discomfort, one of the things that I want to share is the way that the Hanukkah story has changed over time also. So most of you, I believe, know the story of Hanukkah that says that the Romans took over the temple, they sacked it, and that the Maccabees eventually fought back. And when they were cleaning the temple, they rededicated it. They were trying to light the Ner Tamid, the eternal light. There wasn't enough oil. There was a cruse of oil that was enough to light the eternal light for 8 days, for 1 day, excuse me. And the miracle is that it lit for 8 days instead, and that there was enough light and enough oil to sustain them until more could be found. But interestingly, that's not the original story of Hanukkah. So we're going to take a look at some of our ancient texts and try to figure out, how did that story come to be the story that we tell ourselves? So this is a frieze of the spoils of Jerusalem, the Ark of Titus, from around 82 CE. Okay, so if we realize that the second temple was destroyed in 70 CE, we're coming up right about 100. There's a lot of change going on in the ancient Near East at this time, a lot of stories that are happening. And one of the few people who is really keeping a chronicle all of these things is Flavius Josephus. Now, the thing about Josephus, and the reason why he manages to stay alive a lot of the time, he sides with the victors. So we just keep that in mind as we read his story. So he says, on the 5 and 20th day of the month of Kislev, which is Kislev, which the Macedonians call Apelles, they lighted the lamps that were on the candlestick, and they offered incense upon the altar, and they laid the loaves upon the table and offered burnt offerings upon the new altar. So, okay, so we now have sacrifice as part of this holiday, but okay, now Judas celebrated the festival of the restoration of the sacrifices of the temple. The restoration of the sacrifices of the temple. Okay, for 8 days, and emitted no sort of pleasures thereon, but he feasted them upon very rich and splendid sacrifices, and he honored God and delighted them by hymns and psalms. Nay, they were so very glad at the revival of their customs, when, after a long time of intermission, they unexpectedly had regained the freedom of worship, that they made it a law for their posterity, that they should keep a festival on account of the restoration of their temple worship for 8 days. And from that time to this, we celebrate this festival and call it Lights. I suppose the reason was because of this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and thence the name given to that festival. So what we're celebrating here, right, is not necessarily the space being rehabilitated, right? I often think of it as Chanukhat Habayit, right? Of the rededication of the space. But this is saying it's actually the sacrifices that we're excited to have back, and our freedom of worship. And that the lights have to do, of course, with lighting that space. Fine. So that's Flavius Josephus. And then we're going to come to First Maccabees. This is an apocryphal text. And what I mean by apocryphal is that it happens around, again, the Second Temple period, but the Hebrew canon is already closed. It cannot be in the Jewish Bible because the Jewish Bible no longer has books that are being included at this time. So this is a woodcut from 1860 that is supposed to be of Judah Maccabee. This is what somebody in 1860 thought. Okay, fair enough. So we'll read what First Maccabees says. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip down a little bit, down to verse 52. In the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, in 148th year, They rose and offered sacrifice as the law directs on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built at that very season and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it. It was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals, and so they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and joyfully offered burnt offerings. They offered a sacrifice of well-being and a thanksgiving offering. So interestingly, this text tends to corroborate what Josephus was saying, and it doesn't mention candles really at all. I mean, there is the lampstand in the first paragraph that we didn't really go into, but this is all about festivities, but again, about being able to sacrifice. Now we're going to move on to Second Maccabees, right? A little bit later. Another wonderful woodcut. I happen to like this one because I like the idea of Rex, right? Of the king. And the Latin being used here, it makes me really happy. But okay, so and also the plumage. Can you imagine? All right, it's very Vegas. Okay, moving right along. Now Maccabeus and his followers, the Lord leading them on. Interesting, this is new. Recovered the temple and the city, and they tore down the altars that had been built in the public square by the foreigners, and also destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary and made another altar of sacrifice, and then striking fire out of flint, they offered sacrifices after a lapse of 2 years. And they offered incense and lighted lamps and set out the bread of the presence. We're back to sacrifice. It happened on that same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners. The purification of the sanctuary took place, and that is on the 25th day of the same month, which is Kislev, which apparently we're going to spell differently every time because that's one of the traditions of Hanukkah, is not spelling right. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the festival of booths of Sukkot, remembering how not long before, during the festival of booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. And therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches, and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to God, who had given success to the purifying of God's own holy place. And they decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year. Okay. So we have now a holiday that is celebrated more like Sukkot, and that God was on their side, which is a big deal here, by the way, also. And we also appear to have some reference to a kind of democracy, which is interesting to me also, but fine. Now we're going to move on to something completely different. And we're going to have 2 more of these, and then we're going to continue on with talking about narratives. So this is a prayer book from 1738. And interestingly, you know these prayers, some of you know these prayers. Hanisim v'al hanisim v'al ha'porkan v'al ha'gvurot v'al ha'shuvot v'al ha'milchamot she'asita lavotenu b'yamim hazman hazeh, right? Which we still sing, right? For these miracles and for the battles and for the heroism and all these wonderful things that was done for our ancestors at this time in years past. We still sing this. Okay. So now we're into Talmud. So fast forward 300 years or so. Okay. So it says, my Chanukah. What is Chanukah? For our rabbis taught on the 25th of Kislev, that part has not changed, commence the days of Chanukah, which are 8 on which a lamentation for the dead and fasting are forbidden. So we went from feasting and rejoicing to forbidding lamentation, fasting. You're not allowed to mourn on these days. For when the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils therein. And when the Hasmonean dynasty prevailed against and defeated them, they made a search and found only 1 cruse of oil, which lay with the seal of the high priest, but which contained sufficient for 1 day's lighting only. And yet a miracle was wrought therein, and they lit the lamp therewith for 8 days. And the following year, these days were appointed a festival with a recital of Hallel and thanksgiving. So I just want to point out a couple of the things that have changed. 1, we've named the Greeks. They're not just non-Jews. They're not just foreigners. They're Greeks. We are not naming Judah Maccabee. Instead, we're naming the Hasmoneans, which is the family that Judah belonged to. We're including the high priest. Why? Because we don't necessarily want this to be about battle and about these these young upstarts who decided to take it on themselves to fight the Romans, which isn't always the wisest thing to do if you want to stay alive. And we have now made this about a miracle, right? And more about God and less about Judah. Interesting. So we're changing the hero of this story, and we're changing the way we celebrate the story. I have one more that I actually didn't know about until just this year. One more story, and then I'm going to hand things back over to Ned. This is from Avodah Zarah, which is another section of Talmud. This picture, incidentally, is a later depiction of Adam Harishon, of Adam, right? So I want you to think about creation story. We're in Edom. Man and woman, God created them both. Well, one of the ways that our ancestors pictured this was one entity with the two parts, okay? Kind of platonic in that way. All right, so we're moving on. When Adam saw that daytime was progressively diminishing, like it does in winter, he said, "Woe is me, perhaps because I sinned. The world is becoming dark around me and will ultimately return to the primordial state of chaos and disorder. And this is the death that was sentenced upon me from heaven." And he arose and spent 8 days in fasting and in prayer. And once he saw the season of Tevet, the winter solstice had arrived, and the daytime was progressively lengthening, he said, "Clearly the days become shorter and then longer, and this is the order of the world." And he went and observed a festival for 8 days. Just because it's dark doesn't mean we're dying. The light will come back, and we have the power to create our own light as well. So there's a bunch of different stories that we associate, all of them with Hanukkah, and different ways that the way that we have thought about this holiday have transformed over time. So now I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to invite Ned to share as well, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the story of Christmas as well.
Well, it's really interesting to see, and what I'm going to refer to are some of the traditions that make up the core story of the birth of Jesus, the origins of the Christmas story, recognizing that these are also based in texts, and texts about which there's a lot of disagreement and scholarship, etc. So the story of the birth of Jesus really is in 2 of the 4 Gospels, the 4 first books of the Christian New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's in Matthew and Luke. And these Gospels are peculiar books. They're kind of narrative stories, but they're also narrative stories with a definite point of view, and they want to proclaim some message they want everybody to grasp. Matthew, and both of these are written about the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. Matthew sets forth the story of Jesus as Israel's royal Messiah. It's important to Matthew in his storytelling to make sure that the readers, who are probably mostly a Jewish population, that they get the message that this is integral to the prophetic tradition of Judaism, and that what's happening here is a continuation of that tradition, a fulfillment of prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures. And he begins with a genealogy that connects Abraham and then David and Jesus. So the main thing, this is a kind of within the Jewish community, he says this should be continuity. Luke writes for an audience that includes Gentiles as well as Jews, and he uses many fewer quotes from Hebrew Scripture and less emphasis on those prophetic traditions. And he also makes a point of tracing the genealogy of Jesus not back to Abraham, but back to Adam, as if to say, this is a story for the entire world. So the story, the prophecies, and some of you, how many of you know Handel's Messiah? If you know that piece at all, you know there are a whole bunch of prophecies that are sung about there. in the early part of the Messiah. But I'll just read a few from Isaiah 9. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us, authority rests upon his shoulders. He is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Or from Isaiah chapter 7, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel, which is God with us. Or from Isaiah 11, a shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. So for the gospel writers, especially for Matthew, he wanted to make sure that this story gave evidence that these prophecies were being fulfilled. So the story, the story begins in Matthew with the Annunciation, and the angel Gabriel appears to Mary, who is betrothed to Joseph, but we are led to believe the marriage has not been consummated yet. And the angel tells her, "You're going to have a son." And she says, "How is that possible?" And says, "Don't worry, the Holy Spirit will take care of that. Trust, you'll be fine." And this sort of establishes one of the miracles of Christmas, at least as it has come down to us, is this miraculous birth of Jesus. Now, this happens at the time that Caesar is the emperor, and he sends out a decree that everybody should be taxed and counted and go to the home of their families. So Joseph and Mary go to King David's city, which is Bethlehem. And it's important because, again, the storytellers are wanting to prove the point. They're going to, because he's of the house of David. And this is where they are going. They're part of his lineage. Now, as you might suspect, there is a big crowd there. So the couple looks around for a place to stay, and there are no available rooms. And so they finally find a place, not in an inn itself, but in the stable behind the inn. And I don't know how many of you may have heard of the Latin American tradition of posada, la posada. The posada is a tradition of going around, basically reenacting Mary and Joseph looking for an inn and finding no place but the stable. So it's a tradition of going around from place to place in a town, looking for hospitality and not finding it. And it's interesting too, because this sort of picks up a theme of refugees, which is also part of the tradition of this story. Well, while they are in this stable, the baby is born. She wraps him in swaddling clothes and lays him in a manger. And this brings up the tradition that's been incorporated in a lot of carols and songs. There's a song called "The Friendly Beasts," which talks about the animals were there at that time, or "Away in a Manger." Some may have heard of that song. But the notion that this Messiah had the humblest of beginnings. I mean, you cannot imagine a less grandiose beginning or less auspicious. And yet, in this story, there's drama, because nearby there are shepherds in their fields looking after their sheep. And there is a big ruckus, and the angels appear in the sky and say, fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, for unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord, who is the Messiah, who is the anointed one. And the shepherds are terrified, but they listen to the angels and decide they're going to go check it out for themselves. And so they go to the stable and find Mary and Joseph, and they worship this child. This is sort of the key element of most contemporary Christmas pageants, is where the children will reenact this pilgrimage to the manger. Now, in Matthew, the story of there is also a story of 3 wise men from the east who are following up on a prophecy that they have heard that there would be a king of the Jews who would be born, and they're coming to pay homage to this king. They bring gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and it is that gift giving that forms the basis of the gift giving that is central to Christmas and has become central to capitalist societies around the world. How convenient. Now, the arrival of the kings is observed on King's Day, which is Epiphany, or January 6th, which is when you hear about the 12 days of Christmas, that dates from, or that comes from Christmas the 25th to Epiphany. So there's a 12-day period. It's the 12 days of Christmas time. And they had come to Herod, King Herod, who was the regional person in charge. He was not pleased to hear about this prophecy because that would mean a competitor for his power. And so he decided, especially after the 3 wise men decided to go home by another route, that he would ensure that this child arrival was not arrival for long. So he arranged for all the children in that area to be killed, the young children. And this is also incorporated in some carols or songs, Luli Lule, a little tiny child. There's a lot of lullaby traditions that talk about it was a sad time for many as well. Mary and Joseph were warned in a dream that Herod was about to do this, and so they flee into Egypt until it is safe, which is yet another refugee theme that's running through this Christmas story. So that's really the end of the story, but like Hanukkah, this is the beginning of embellishments, which have been pretty much nonstop ever since. So I'll open it back up to you, Rabbi, and see what we can do here.
All right, so I have lots of questions. So when we say annunciation, what we mean is that someone's letting them know that he's coming. It's an announcement. That's what annunciation means.
It's an announcement to Mary. It's announcing to Mary that she is going to give birth to a divinely conceived child in the story.
Okay.
So there's
So,
not, of course, universal agreement about what that actually means.
oh, that's fair. I just wanted to make sure that I knew the word.
Yeah, it's an annunciation to her.
So I have to say, as you're telling the story, and I have heard the story before, and I have read some of the Gospels, I can't help but hear echoes, which is something that we do when we study Torah, right? Of God telling Sarah that she's going to give birth, and that being incredible and her not believing, and sort of the miraculous notion of that when she's in her 90s. When I hear about Herod, of course, I hear echoes of Moses and Pharaoh. When you say that Joseph and Mary go to Egypt, I actually had not heard that part of the story, so that's very interesting to me. But it happens throughout Genesis that the Israelites are escaping often famine, but also war, by going to Egypt. And of course, we have to come out of slavery from Egypt after that. And so there are these amazing overlaps in the stories to begin with, which is really interesting to me.
Well, and it is true that the stories come out of a tradition of learned Jews. And people who knew all of the Jewish traditions, and in this case, we're determined that this story of a person that in their lives and experience was of supreme importance, that story get told much more widely.
So I think that's really interesting. And I think that one of the things that you and I have noted are some of the commonalities between the stories. And I think where things get challenging for many of us is when it comes to the celebrations themselves, right? First of all, because from our perspective, look, Hanukkah is a post-Torah-itic holiday, right? Meaning that it comes after the Torah is codified. And in general, the holidays that are post-Torah-itic are not as significant as holidays. We think about Hanukkah, we think about Purim. There are other holidays that have to do with Israel that we still think of as significant, but they're not really celebrated the same way religiously, whereas Christmas is a huge deal. I mean, the birth of a savior is about as significant as you can get, one would think.
Yeah, although there are certainly strains of Christianity that don't put such a big emphasis on Christmas. I mean, for some traditions, Easter is the ultimate Christian holiday.
Because salvation comes from Easter.
And Christmas is a kind of it also ran holiday. Although in our culture, I mean, I would say it's probably, I would say Christmas has had the most influence of any Christian holiday on our culture as a whole.
Okay.
On U.S. culture, American culture, and Western European culture, say.
Which is interesting, because one might be able to argue that in return, Western culture has sort of taken some of the spirituality out of Christmas, which is one of the arguments that people who have multiple faiths in one house would say, is that we can celebrate things without necessarily having a religious bent on them. So how do you, as a practitioner and as a clergy person, how do you feel about that?
Well, it's really interesting, especially being a Unitarian Universalist clergy person, because as many of you know, our tradition does not identify itself as a Christian tradition. It's basically a multi-faith tradition. So we have members of our congregations who would describe themselves as Christian, but most of our members would not. So there was probably a movement starting in the 60s, perhaps, or early, called Keep Christ in Christmas. You may have seen license plates and other things. I think there's been a recognition for at least half a century that the holiday that comes around in December each year bears little or no relationship to a religious holiday. It is a consumption holiday. It is an economic boon for businesses, and Santa and the Christmas spectacle, which is only tangentially related anymore to the story that the scripture just said, is made a big departure from that. So I think how you feel about that depends a little bit on the degree to which this story is integral to your faith. And I would say that again, for many people, it is not the most important Christian holiday, and some of the beliefs that were embedded in the story, like the virgin birth. I mean, my dad challenged the virgin birth when he was like 10 years old, which was one of the reasons why they were content to be Unitarian Universalists or Unitarians, because that was not a requirement of faith. So I think there's a very wide spectrum of opinion about what is critical about the Christmas story.
So, as somebody who grew up in a Jewish family, who married someone who converted out of Catholicism, I have, I don't know, been a part of a Christmas celebration maybe twice in my life. And my experience of it was there was a tree, there was a lot of food, fair amount of drinking, some gift giving. And I think that one or two of them might have gone to church late in the evening, but not the whole family. And that was the celebration. Is there a standard celebration for Christmas for those of us who may not have experience with that?
I would say the most widespread, at least in this country, the most widespread service that would draw people on Christmas would be a Christmas Eve service. Oftentimes there's a children's service earlier in the day, and then later at night, either at 7 o'clock or at 10 o'clock, there'll be a candlelight service. And that will consist of lessons and carols, lessons from scripture, carols, readings, music, and I would say that the key event in the key moment in that service is the lighting of candles and dimming of lights, so that everyone, the community of people who are gathered there, experience their unity as a congregation in this candle light. And it's a moving thing. But whether the Christmas story has deep spiritual meaning for someone hinges entirely, I think, on their relationship with the story and with their faith tradition. And there's no guarantee. Certainly, higher church traditions will try to preserve the linkage between Christ and Christmas.
As opposed to Irving Berlin, who tries to make it about snow.
Snow and well, and for lucky for us, I mean, there are some sort of I think it's really one of the big questions. It'd be interesting to ask everybody who's here. There's a kind of universalist strain about Christmas, and probably about some elements of the Hanukkah story too. Light in darkness, goodwill toward all people, generosity and giving gifts, and people, regardless of their faith, are attracted to those themes. But those themes leave out a lot of the particularities that are really important for Jewish congregations with regard to the genuine Hanukkah stories you told us, and similarly for Christian traditions that are for whom the theology of Christmas is really important.
Which I think is interesting, because I think one of the things that we're talking about is how do we, as people who live in a world with who embrace pluralism, who may have families that have multiple traditions in them, what are the values that we want to stress during this holiday? So I'm curious, if you would, friends at home, write in the chat box, what is a value that you wish, that you hope that your family shares at this time, whether they are Jewish, whether they are Christian, whether they're Universalist Unitarian, whether they are Muslim or Hindu or any other faith tradition. What is a value that you would hope that we would all be able to hold together and to celebrate together in a universal way rather than in a particularistic way? And Nancy, thank you for sharing some of your experiences in terms of what you did to celebrate Christmas from the Catholic perspective. It's really interesting to me also. I've never been to a midnight mass. I have been to a mass before. But... all right. You all are being shot. Okay. Celebration of freedom. I like that. Okay. Interesting.
And charity, giving back.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Charity and giving back. I didn't see that one. Thank you. Yeah. Of giving, family together, being a light in the world, coming together as family, celebrating with family, hospitality, gift giving. I'm sure is where it's going to. Nancy, if you will guide me, I will go. So how about that? Gratitude. So what's interesting is how many different ways we can reach these values and reach these goals that aren't necessarily exclusionary, that can be welcoming of each other. And I think that it is, certainly a good thing to be with family. And yes, we can have various and sundry traditions and ways of celebrating, but also to try to think about how do we achieve these values when with our families rather than alienating each other through traditions that we don't share. And I think that that can be worthwhile. Playing dreidel. So Arlene, one of the reasons we play dreidel, though, is to tell the story, right? The letters say Nes Gadol Hayasham, a great miracle happened there, which incidentally is supposed to apply to both sets of holidays. But it was a way of sharing the story that was accessible to kids, but also was a way of keeping alive a story that might not have been acceptable to tell out loud in times of persecution. Leslie shares, my family is Jewish, Christian, fundamentalist Christian, and Catholic, and we share traditions and value acceptance of each other's belief. Love is evident at all of our holidays. That's amazing. That's amazing. And it's really beautiful. And
I think, I mean, at the core, theologically, it seems to me that the God's love for the Jewish people, God's love for humanity, that is the underlying energy of both stories.
I think that's right. And I think that, when we hear about things like potentially the war on Christmas, when we think about some of these things, I think it is an attempt to stir conflict, to divide us, because it helps people achieve, I don't know, politics that they want, rather than allowing us to come together as people who do fundamentally have so much in common and who can bring light into the world. So I think there is potential there for us to do a lot of good with what's in common.
It's so tricky to take to hold both at the same time, the particularity of each of these holidays and the fact that the world we live in, we want to celebrate that particularity without making it impossible for other people to celebrate the particularity of their beliefs and holidays and stories and narratives. Yeah. And we seem to have a very hard time doing that. We seem somehow to kind of want, there's one story and it's mine, and my way or the highway. It's bizarre.
Well, I think there's that, and I think there's this notion that we've all been told how special we are, and that we think that therefore that specialness has to be to the exclusion of anyone else being special. And I would hope that especially people who have multiple children know how true it can be that each person is fundamentally the most special person that there is, and that everyone is that special, and that we hold both of those things at the same time. Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear from a couple of people, if you have any that have kids and have had to kind of wrestle with how do you hold this multiplicity of, like Leslie's family, hold this multiplicity and teach kids in a way that that doesn't just completely baffle them or overwhelm them, or I mean, just be interested if there's anybody who would be willing to share about that.
Yeah. Feel free to unmute and to share a story if you'd like. So I'll start off because this is great fun to me. As you all know, I have one little, Sabine, she's 5. And when she came home from daycare at age 2, she very, very much wanted to celebrate Christmas. And that was a very big deal. And I said, you know, other people celebrate Christmas and we celebrate Hanukkah and we're going to support them. And over the years, she's gotten a little bit feisty about, I don't think there's a Santa Claus, which is a problem for Jewish kids, by the way. And I, you know, so I said to Sabine, and some of you have heard this story, oh, are there other people that your friends may believe in that you don't? I don't think Wonder Woman is real. Well, I said to her, I said, you know, being smart is being able to figure out what's real and what's not real. And being wise is figuring out who to share that information with. And so for our friends that celebrate Hanukkah, we can have that conversation with them. And for our friends that celebrate Christmas, let's let them have that specialness, okay? Okay, Mom. And so, and I know that this is a conversation that happens in lots of different ways in Jewish homes. Anybody who's had to explain to a kid that Santa comes to a cousin's house, but maybe not their house or vice versa? Anybody want to share that kind of conversation? Laura, do you want to tell us the story? First unmute, yeah.
Oh, goodness. So many.
Yeah.
I used to tell my children that Santa came to other children's houses, but we celebrated interfaith in our family because I said, although our children went to Hebrew school and was raised with every Jewish holiday, that I would never deprive my in-laws of their joy of Christmas or Easter. It was very important to them to hide the chocolate bunnies and to have a big Christmas. And so we combined. And the first time I hosted the holidays, I went to a butcher in my town, a suburb of Chicago, and said to the butcher, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm Jewish and they eat ham. I don't know what to do. He said, honey, don't you worry. You come back, he told me on a certain day, I'll have it all ready for you and it will be tied. All you have to do is heat it up. So that holiday we had brisket. We had, we used to have kishka. We had the ham. We had everything that my in-laws used to do and everything my family did. So my children grew up with both holidays together the whole time. And that's how we did it. And they understood that some children had Santa and some children don't. And it was a family discussion and we should keep our own discussions within our family.
So the values that you were underscoring was honoring your in-laws and honoring the parents, was inclusiveness, was asking questions and finding new ways of doing things, and openness and discussion. And I love that those were the underlying values that you were going with. That's amazing. Yeah.
We had to make it work and we had a wonderful time. They have wonderful memories of all the big Hanukkahs with my parents and the great Christmases they had with Tom's parents and their cousins on both sides. So it was all good, but it was a little tricky because especially when they go to public school and they're one of a minority of children, that made it a little hard. Lots of talking in our family, lots of discussions all the time.
As it should be.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share? Barbara? Yeah.
Yeah, I will share. So when Ian, my older son, was in kindergarten, I explained to his teacher that we celebrated both holidays because my husband is not Jewish, but not particularly religious. I mean, he's not religious at all. He's against organized religion, basically.
He's
So-
actually Unitarian, but never mind. We won't.
And I always say
Yeah.
we're not that organized, so okay.
Yeah, right. So anyway, it was actually Valentine's Day, and Ian brought me a Valentine with Jesus in the Valentine. And I was like not too happy. And so I spoke to the kindergarten teacher. I said, "Why is Jesus in my Valentine?" And she said, "Oh, this little boy, Ronnie, he's very into Jesus and he's sharing pictures of Jesus with everybody. So he gave one to Ian." She said, "But I thought you said you celebrate both holidays." And I said, "Yes, we do, but we celebrate like Santa and we do have a tree and candy canes, but we don't do manger scenes. And for Easter, we do egg hunts and Easter bunnies, but we don't do crucifixes. So that's basically how we celebrate it.
Yeah, it's a great, it could be a great resource for all of us to recognize that that particularly Christmas and Easter are both rooted in pre-Christian pagan traditions, which have given us the Christmas tree and eggs, and so there is this array of non-theological or non-ecclesiastical traditions that are also part of these two holidays that we can draw upon, which is very. How did that the Valentine, the Jesus Valentine reason? How did you resolve that with your son?
I mean, he was in kindergarten. I think I just said, "Please don't, hearts are good. Please don't put Jesus in my Valentines."
I don't need Jesus in my Valentines. Okay.
It's not, I mean, maybe Saint Valentine would have worked out, but
Yeah.
it's
Interesting, right? And again, so much of it has to do with the values. Yeah, Nancy?
So I have a dilemma. I mean, some people know blah, blah, blah. I converted, from Catholicism. So I have a background in celebrating Christmas in that way. But I have a struggle, like a current struggle with Hanukkah versions of what I perceive to be Christmas things, like gingerbread houses in blue and white. Or, I'm trying to that's the one that comes to mind immediately. Or, Christmas cookies in blue and white that are clearly, in my head, they're Christmas products.
Or how about even the Christmas tree with the decoration, with the Jewish ornaments?
Yeah,
So,
I
So
mean, is that
Nancy,
in the same
what
category?
makes a gingerbread house a Christmas thing?
because it's covered in red and green candy. And I think the tradition, and there's probably like a history of what that tradition is, but I think because the tradition grew out of a Christmas celebration, and it's got red and green and snow and whatever. So I associate it with Christmas, and that's the time of year you can buy all that stuff and whatever. But the last few years, you can get, the same companies are making a blue and white version of it, or there's blue and white, what I would think of are Christmas cookies. So I just wonder, being inclusive, is it going too far?
Interesting. So do you feel, so I'm curious as to whether you're saying that you feel that the Christian holiday is being impinged upon, or that you feel like the Jews are being marketed to?
The Jews are being marketed to, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Like they're just, it's like applying, another, and the other one, and I have to admit, I have one. There's Mensch on a Bench, who is the Jewish answer to Elf on a Shelf.
Right, but
Oh,
elves on a shelf
I
is a
didn't know.
fairly recent thing, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's only about 25 years old. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't, the mensch on the bench I got way after my son was of that age. So I don't even know what you're supposed to do with it, but he's supposed to do good deeds or something like that too. Like, like the elf on the shelf, but it's clearly they're in response to each other.
They are. But I think that these holidays are in conversation, right? So I happen to know a very nice lady who makes something like a gingerbread sukkah with my little one. And so, we take what we know and
There's not a tree in sight.
Well, the other thing is that
There might be a lot of candy though.
given the wonderful the cuisine, the food opportunities for Hanukkah, it seems like gingerbread's sort of a poor substitute for really good latkes and
oh, for
I
all
mean,
of that oil.
if you
Okay.
ask me, yeah. So I mean, I think developing and fully exploiting the opportunities within the tradition is something worth looking at anyway.
So I think that that's true too. I think that there is a lot to delve into each in our own traditions, but I also think that one of the things that we're hearing about today is that it's okay to take what you know and to apply it to family that you love, and to include and to ask and to inquire, and then to celebrate in lots of different ways. And I think that sometimes we hear our ancestors maybe judging us or maybe critiquing, and the truth is they did things that their ancestors would have had questions about too. And I'm not saying that that Jews need to start having creches on their front lawn. I really don't think that that's probably the direction that we're headed in anyway. But I am saying that there are ways to take our common values and to celebrate those in ways that we already have at our disposal. And so with that, I'm going to ask you, Ned, are any closing words you wanted to share?
No, but somebody's going to have to tell me what an elf on a shelf is, because I have no clue. So
Anybody have one? I don't. Does anybody have one?
Or maybe I could ask for a mensch on a bench for my Christmas present this year.
I'll get you both for Christmas, Ned.
Caitlin, thank you.
I'll
Thank
get you both of those.
Thank you very much. Oh my God, who knew?
Well,
That's great.
I want to thank you so much for joining us again. Ned, this was lovely. And thank you for everybody who participated, everybody who shared a story. Lori, thank you for gathering us all. I hope everybody has a wonderful season where you elevate your values and where light shines in the darkness, and we all find a way to come together. So thank you all very, very much.
And let the people say amen.
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 Let's love everybody. Good night.
Thanks,
Good
Ed.
night.
Thanks, Rabbi. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks so much.
Lori, you're wonderful. Thank you, Ned. I so appreciate it. This was fun.
Thank
So,
you. This was
is
fun.
great.
It was
Sets
terrific.
us up
Thanks
for
so
the year.
much.
Sets
All right,
us
have
up
a good
for the
night.
season. Thanks for sharing, everyone.
Mwah.